Another example that I want to give you, which is actually really the focus of the topic that I wanted to address a bit more, is the idea of building capacity in the area of parent support and touching on sort of two topics. So here the two trends, if you like, in autism research have been increasing over time. One is that we're moving what are previously could be called experimental or laboratory types of treatments and interventions directly into real-world settings, right? So the traditional way of doing research has been that we go in our laboratories, we develop an intervention package, typically delivered by an expert team, lots of PhDs and MDs, and it takes something like 45 or 50 hours a week, and that's as much as we know about that particular package of intervention. And we quickly realized over time that that's just not going to cut it. If we're talking about prevalence estimates between 1% and 2%, that means that we're never going to achieve a time where we're able to deliver these interventions at scale, right? If we're trying to serve a whole population and our number is 1% to 2%, then we really need to be thinking carefully about the kinds of resources that need to go into these packages. And I'm not saying that we need to sort of water them out or dumb them down. It's just that we haven't tried many other models that rely on different delivery mechanisms that sort of vary the person who's delivering or vary the number in a way that could inform us whether we actually need to think very differently about the problem. So there's been some really good research in more recent years to show that alternative models delivered directly, for example, in school settings and increasingly in the home environment are basically the way to go if we're trying to reach that level of scalability and deliver at a whole population level. So just to give you an example of how we've been thinking, and this is probably something that you guys have gained a lot of expertise in. So this is sort of an illustration of the different kinds of events that have been planned in our community in the next few months, and we've done several before. But the idea here is that when we're thinking about sharing knowledge or moving knowledge into practice and back, as I said, because that's a very important direction for us, there are three themes that come into interplay that we have to be thinking about very carefully. One is, again, the obvious one, what is the state of science? So you have a very nice intervention coming from a prestigious university. We already have evidence that it's efficacious, that it can actually lead to improved outcomes or a tool, and you have sort of engaged experts in that topic. On the other end are things like population characteristics, so things like, for us, who are the people who are going to pick up that intervention and deliver it, right? Is it school teachers? Is it primary care workers? Is it preschool teachers? So these are the kinds of things that we have to sort of think about actively. And then that brings up considerations in the middle of, well, is that even feasible for these people to do? And what kind of infrastructure do we have to take it? And then increasingly, we're valuing our work with health economists who are teaching us really about how cost effectiveness can be measured. So instead of just thinking, okay, we need X amount of hours for this particular intervention, do we have direct data that comes from those settings themselves to suggest that that amount of hours is actually leading to substantive improvement using outcomes that we have to define and measure carefully? Right? And of course, the issue that I'm sure you grapple with as much as we do is sustainability, that it's very nice to bring the leading experts from far away, have them spend a couple of days with us and do some training for 5 or 6 people, and you come back next month and nobody's using anything that they learned in that really expensive but very, very nice workshop that you had, right? So this is something that we're thinking very carefully about, and how do we implement mechanisms in the work that we're doing when we're doing these types of community training to how to improve uptake and long-term impact of what we do. So just to give you an example of some of the things that we learned along the way, we had a number of these previous sessions, both at an international and a local level, look at this question of instrument translation, which was an obsession of our field about 7 or 8 years ago. So every grant was being funded to translate the ADOS and ADI for use in different countries, right? So we sort of tried to take a step back and try to understand a broader question of what could improve identification in the community, right? So let's park the tools for a minute. if our goal is to improve identification in the community, then what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about? So here what we learned from, again, our expert in community engagement is that identification will be successful insofar as the level of awareness, right? So if your primary care workers don't know what autism looks like, if your pediatricians are telling parents to wait and see, then we don't have a lot of awareness at the level that we need it, right? And I include pediatricians in that. Maybe their awareness and training, right? Identification needs to be, again, informed by a solid understanding of child development and the family context. This is, again, how we protect against cultural biases, because there's a lot more similarities than differences in the early years. And then we need to take a purposeful approach. So, I think I love Dr. Green's example of the big debates that you'll hear in many meetings about the birthday party and the ADOS. So people know what the ADOS is, right? This is diagnostic observation schedule. We use it as part of a diagnostic assessment for autism, very routinely used, excellent test, right? And yet we sit in a lot of meetings that debate whether it's appropriate to have a birthday party as part of that test, because that is not culturally appropriate in some places. Well, I don't really care, because when I'm using the ADOS to test something that is an underlying construct in that birthday party, an underlying construct that asks, what is the nature of social engagement that this child has with me or with their caregiver, then I'm going to simulate a birthday party, right? I'm going to prompt them to see how they respond. So if it's not a birthday party, it could be whatever else they like. It could be a toy in the room. It could be their favorite toy. And this is where the tool sometimes kind of diverts a little bit our attention from something much more important, which is whether the person administering those tests has a very good understanding of the underlying constructs of what they're looking for in a diagnostic setting, right? So I think a lot of these discussions could be shifted to improving that training and understanding rather than pure training on the tools that sometimes can fire back in ways that are not very helpful. So again, the other big theme that focus on screening and diagnosis needs to be balanced with what happens after, right? So that it's viewed from a public healthcare perspective as unethical to screen, for instance, for a condition where there is a sort of concrete, actionable things that are going to happen as a result of that screening. And again, something that we hear a lot in our interaction with our colleagues globally is that we need to think about where our systems are most strong, and then think, how could we adapt that strength to benefit a broader population of kids who have autism, right? So instead of coming into a new community that doesn't have any autism services and setting up like the brand new center and then trying to train people from scratch, we ask, well, is there a good childhood program that I can go and work with, right? Is there an excellent community rehabilitation service where autism will be understood and the skills adapted much more easily than I would bringing sort of a new cohort of people and starting them off with something that's brand new. And I think we could benefit a lot from thinking about that even in Canada, and I don't think we do it enough. So one of the other workshops that we held was entirely focused on diagnosis in a cross-cultural setting, essentially to meet the needs of our community. And people sort of came to agreement that irrespective of the nature of the diversity that we're dealing with, the common elements that need to be incorporated into assessment. You'll also hear the word that I really like, the active ingredients. That's sort of the concept that's emerging now, that instead of thinking about tools or packages, that we have to ask, well, what are we trying to achieve and what could get us there? So these are sort of some of the things that people agreed would be common to any good diagnostic assessment. And then the tools essentially are used to inform that rather than to replace what the clinician needs to be doing. And we heard a lot, I think it was also mentioned this morning, that tools sometimes become a gateway to accessing services, which is a very, very dangerous trend. So the idea that you have to sort of have a test to prove that you have autism or a score above a given threshold is clearly misuse of these tests and really goes against the reason they were developed in the first place. Here we heard a lot about that we had sort of big discussions about the cultural differences and what clinicians could do to avoid them, but we also needed to make sure, and I think everybody in this audience based on this morning understands that very quickly, that we shouldn't sort of jump to assume cultural differences when sometimes there's many other types of explanations that could be much simpler to account for what we're thinking about. So if some of you are interested, I'm happy to share sort of the longer reports that came out of several of those sessions, including ones directly delivered for people who work in that diagnostic setting. Okay, so that's sort of an example of how we've applied those concepts in the area of identification. What about building capacity in the area of intervention? Very, very difficult and challenging topics. Here, I think one of what we could think of sort of as a emerging success in the field. Oops, sorry. So I have here, I don't think it's going to zoom into it, but some of you will recognize this horrible book, psychiatrist from a long time ago. This is sort of the Bruno Bettelheim idea of the refrigerator mother. And I think the idea that the shift that we've taken isn't simply to reject the idea of a refrigerator mother, but to say that at least within the early years, our best bet for supporting a child with autism or a broader neurodevelopmental disorder would be through their family and community context. Right? So we're essentially relying on them instead of blaming them. So this is sort of the big shift that we've taken in this area. Now, this has led to some pretty nice movement in the scientific field. So we've seen only in the last year one of the first formal randomized controlled trials to show that we're able to start working with kids much earlier than the age of diagnosis, so even within the period where they're at high risk. And there, the neat thing is that we already know that our interventions have to be lighter, more ecologically sensitive, embedded in mealtime and bath time and playtime, not so much in a clinic, in a room disconnected from the rest of the world. And so we have initial evidence to suggest that actually benefits can be ascertained even prior to the age that a label is assigned, and with the hope that this would help shift the developmental pathway in ways that are positive for that family. And we also saw another really excellent example coming out of India. This is Vikram Patel and Jivan Gowri and colleagues. Actually, it was India and Pakistan. It was a 2-site study. Again, very, very nicely conducted randomized control trial. I think it sort of removed the myth that you can't do a randomized control trial in a low-income country. These guys did it. And the data suggested, what they did in terms of a process, what they did is that they took a package that was developed in the UK. They did a really thorough process adaptation, going through multiple steps to ask questions about cultural validity of the intervention, to have their local clinicians and essentially feedback. So essentially your initial package became just a reference point for what you could deliver. And their conclusion in the end is that they changed very little, if anything, from the active ingredients. What they did was something like simplify the language of the description, right? Substitute some of the strategies or tools that were being used to be more culturally sensitive. So according to this group, they're telling the rest of us, actually, it might be not as complicated as we think it is because we just haven't sort of tried in a fairly straightforward way and logical way, and the idea that the family context might share a lot of commonalities in these cultures. Right? So this, again, in the context of a low-income country where there's many challenges in service delivery. So for me, this sort of sets the bar for us very, very high when we complain about the lack of resources and our lack of ability to deliver better care, that sometimes we might just need to be thinking differently about the problem.